As war between the humans and the Juireans continue, the aliens are desperate for new recruits to help them fight off the pesky creatures from Earth. Now, on the planet Hyben, a desperate native is looking for a way out from his own particular set of troubles, and joining the war effort just might be the ticket. And then something unexpected happens that changes his perspective. Suddenly, the threat was real, and in his face. The humans caused all this, Pol thought. And now, as he walked quickly down the concrete walkway toward Land Hall, he couldn't decide whether he was happy or sad. In either case, tonight would be a life-altering event for him, and if one thing was certain, he was glad to be out of his chamber and away from the chattering of his mates. Pol had to admit times were tough on Hyben. Ever since the Juireans had pulled their ships out of the maintenance yards and sent them off to confront the evil human threat, his hours had been cut back drastically, and what credits he did have in reserve had been quickly exhausted. And now his Lumic mate was badgering him constantly about the lack of mature food he was bringing into the chamber, with the nagging urged on by his two Nin mates. For their part, the females were doing the best they could, producing pups at a feverish pace. Yet even then, it was barely enough to keep the older offspring fed. That practice of feeding freshborns to newvins was another problem for Pol, and one potentially greater than the financial difficulties he was in. The succulent meat of the recently emerged freshborns carried within it all the essential chemicals and nutrients that his older offspring required. Yet as more of their diet consisted of freshborn flesh, they risked addiction to the taste of their brethren. As adults, Pol and his mates could resist the urges, but not so the younger members of his pod, if he could not provide more mature meat for his family, and soon. Then all his offspring would be forever lost to the bloodlust for young meat. As newvins, this practice was accepted, if frowned upon. But as adults, the killing and devouring of freshborns was strictly forbidden. If something wasn't done soon, his older offspring would be hopelessly consumed by the desire for this forbidden flesh, and they would seek it out, either from his pod or from others. Already, there were reports of newvin attacks on outside pods. And now Pol, within his own chamber, was breeding a new horde of these potential cannibalistic feeders. It was bad all over Hyben, and even though no formal battle had yet been joined between the Juireans and the humans within expansion space, the coming war was already having a devastating effect on his planet, as well as the sector as a whole. As it turned out, the rumors had been true, and the population of the expansion soon learned the shocking reality behind the recent attack upon a planet called Earth, and the resulting destruction of the Juirean fleet. At first, many had refused to believe the stories, but now even the Juirean-controlled newscasts were reporting on the defeat. Pol found the news to be of considerable distress. It had been over 400 years since the Juireans had first swept down upon Hyben, dispelling any disbelief in the existence of other life forms within the galaxy, and as the centuries passed, the natives of Hyben had become completely integrated into the Juirean expansion. The planet now served as a major maintenance hub for most of the starships traveling throughout the nearby sectors, with dozens of off-world species intermingled among its native population. If the Juireans were now vulnerable to defeat, then the entire structure of the expansion was at risk. And where would that leave his planet, his race, and his pod? For his part, Pol had once been a very accomplished tech installer, maneuvering expertly within the narrow confines of any number of major-class starships, working on various gravity generators, air purifiers, computer modules, and more. It was this experience he was counting on to land him a well-paying position aboard one of the hundreds of new Class 5 warships soon to be coming out of the sectors beyond the core. Even now, the Juireans were engaged in a massive building frenzy, the likes of which had not been seen since the days of the Mass. Yet as they turned out dozens of new starships every month, the Juireans soon discovered a problem. They had the means of production and they had the materials. What they lacked were the crews for all the new ships being built to counter the marauding human invaders. And that was the impetus for the meeting taking place that evening in Land Hall. If Pol could find work aboard one of these new warships, he would immediately gain two distinct benefits. First, he would earn enough credits to provide a better life for him and his pod, including mature meat for the newvins, sparing them the possibility of having to be put down by the authorities. And secondly, it would get him off the planet, and away from the constant berating from his mates. As Pol hurried to the meeting, he firmed his resolve to do whatever it took to gain employment with the Juireans, even if such employment did carry with it the danger of confronting the evil human barbarians. Yet in light of his current financial situation, it was a risk he was willing to take. However, as he rounded the corner of Juan and Mayu streets, Pole's heart sank. There, in the dimming light of early evening, he saw a long line of primes, snaking its way out of Lan Hall and wrapping around the entire building. There were at least 1,000 other beings all there with the same goal in mind as he. Dejected, Pole stepped to the back of the line, just behind two shorter creatures in black cloaks and hoods, and prayed to the bellow gods that the Juireans were looking for more than just a handful of new recruits for their ships this evening. After all, he couldn't face the prospect of returning to his chamber with bad news for his mates. If he did, they just might set upon him in a feeding frenzy of their own. As more creatures lined up behind him, each seeking their own ounce of salvation from the depressed economy, Pole produced a wry grin and thought, "If my mates did fill their bellies with my flesh, at least then my troubles would be over. I wonder what I actually taste like." Nerves soon got the better of him, and Pole began to chat with the other beings in the line. The native behind him was named Juirean, and he had worked at the power-generating plant in Mole until the workforce had been cut back 6 months before. He was an expert with containment chambers, and Pole agreed that Juirean's skills should be in demand aboard any decent-sized starship. Juirean returned the encouragement to Pole. The smaller of the hooded creatures in front of him was more talkative than the taller one. It was a female, and she agreed that the need was great for crews aboard the new Juirean ships, saying there should be plenty of work for all. As the line moved inexorably forward, Pole's mood improved. Even though there were more than 1,000 applicants for the crews there that night, and with more joining the line every minute, he was feeling much better about his chances. Eventually, Pole entered the hall, and the line continued to wind its way toward the table where the Juireans sat. There were 5 of them, all green-haired guards, looking serious and bored. Pole had encountered numerous Juireans aboard the ships he serviced. Although he had never spoken with one directly, he was both nervous and excited at the prospect of having an actual conversation with one. As he fixated on the Juireans, Pole couldn't help but notice that the table they sat at was surrounded by 8 very large and impressive-looking creatures of a species he didn't recognize. He knew the Juireans often traveled with bodyguards these days, a practice Pole found particularly disturbing. After all, these were Juireans, the leaders of the expansion. The fact that they now required guards themselves meant that the human threat was apparently much more serious than first believed. Pole tried to put these thoughts out of his mind, but that became more difficult when he noticed the 2 massive electronic posters displayed on the walls behind the Juireans. Each showed the same larger-than-life prime, with powerful, muscular arms streaked with bulging blue veins. The creature was naked from the waist up, with bandoliers of Sci-fi power packs crisscrossing his chest, and in his hands he cradled an evil-looking double-barrel flash rifle. The beast was displaying blood-dripping fangs and horns sprouted from his forehead, just above the red, fierce eyes that stared down at all in the room that evening. Above the image, and written in Hyben with letters standing 2 meters tall, were the words, "This is your enemy. This creature will destroy your homes, your families, your way of life. Beware the human savage. Join the Juirean cause today and save your worlds. Signing advance available." Pole swallowed hard, staring at the image. He could not understand Juirean logic. An image such as this did nothing to firm his resolve. Rather, it only made him question his decision to come here in the first place. After all, the Hyben were more pacifists than warriors. In fact, if it wasn't for the dire financial condition he was in, Pole would have left the hall that moment and returned to the safety and security of his chamber, far beneath the warm, red soil of his homeworld. Pole glanced around the room, noticing a number of additional tables set up where members from a dozen different species were all seated before Hyben bureaucrats, each busily entering data into computer terminals. Very few of the occupants in the hall were being turned away. It appeared the Juireans were taking all comers. Pole looked up at the menacing image again and then back at the tables where recruits were being enlisted. By now he was only a few creatures from the Juireans, and it was now or never. If he was going to change his mind, it would have to be soon. The 2 hooded figures in front of him moved up to the Juirean table.
"State your name and race,"
one of the Juireans commanded without looking up. The taller of the beings spoke first.
"I have a question. Do you allow mating pairs to enlist together?"
The Juirean glanced up.
"That depends. Does your mate have any skills that would be of value?"
The female stepped a little closer to the table.
"Yes, I have skills."
She then reached up and pulled the hood back from her head, revealing a cascade of long yellow hair.
I'm very good at killing Juirean scum, like you.
In a flash, the female produced a half-meter-long double-edged sword. She displayed it momentarily before the widening eyes of the 5 Juireans seated at the table. Then, with a push of a button on the hilt, the sword expanded out to a full meter in length. With a flick of her wrist, she sent the shiny blade in the direction of the Juirean who had been speaking. An instant later, his head separated from his neck and tumbled sideways to the floor. Before the others could react, the female had severed the head of the Juirean to her right, while the other hooded creature produced a blade of his own, decapitating the other 3 Juirean guards in a single, fluid motion of his sword. Pole was sprayed with Juirean blood as he stood in shocked disbelief, before being shoved out of the way by a surge of bodyguards, all rushing forward to pile upon the 2 assassins. Pole fell back into the line of waiting recruits, starting a cascade of tumbling bodies that continued through at least 20 or more of the beings behind him. Through his panic and confusion, Pole now saw 2 large piles of bodyguards, completely subduing the killers. But then a blood-covered blade suddenly shot out of the back of one of the guards. It quickly receded, only to appear a breath later out of the back of another. In the meantime, one of the hulking guards in the other pile flew into the air and landed face up in front of Pole. The guard's eyes were closed, and although Pole could see no wounds, he instinctively knew the creature was dead. And then the 2 assassins exploded out of the piles of now dead guards, standing with fierce, wild looks in their eyes, blood dripping down their faces and staining their clothing. As Pole lay on the bed of creatures who had fallen with him, he looked at the face of the male assassin, and then at the image looming behind him on the wall. Except for the lack of horns and fangs, the creature standing before him was a human. The stampede had begun, and Pole strained to regain his feet and make his way to the exit. Yet before he could, the female human shot past him at an unbelievable speed, crashing through the panicked crowd to place her back against the double exit doors, preventing any in the room from escaping. The human male then jumped effortlessly to the top of the table, where only moments before, the 5 Juireans had sat. He threw off his blood-soaked cloak and swung a Sci-fi flash rifle from around his back. He lifted the deadly weapon in his hands and sent a bolt into the ceiling. The room became deathly quiet as all eyes fell upon the human. Holding the flash rifle as he did, the image of the savage human killer was now complete. This was the enemy, and the enemy was here, on Pole's planet. The human waved the rifle to his left.
All of you move to this side of the room. Hurry.
And then the creature pointed the barrel of the rifle directly at him.
Everyone except you.
Pole nearly fainted, and his nin arms began to click and quiver uncontrollably. He used his mid-arms to place the nins in his pockets to still them, and then rose slowly to his feet. The human was staring at him.
You seem like a peaceful creature.
The human said to him,
Why do you want to fight against us? Our war is with the Juireans, not you.
Pole was surprised that words could still emanate from his throat, even though they cracked as they did so.
I do not want to fight you. I just need the credits to support my pod.
The creature nodded.
I can understand that.
Then the human looked behind the table and down at the boxes of Juirean credits sitting on the floor, the source of the signing advance most of the recruits were to receive that evening. He turned to address the room.
My name is Cain. Remember that. You will be asked. We humans are at war with the Juireans because they came to our homeworld and killed over 1 billion of our people. We were no threat to them, yet they attacked anyway, surely out of fear and evil intent. But you can be assured that we will not rest until every last Juirean is dead. You can join them and die, or you can remain neutral and you will not be harmed. The choice is yours.
Then the creature looked down at Pole.
Come here,
he commanded as he jumped off the back of the table. Pole did as he was told. The human bent down and scooped up a large handful of credits from one of the boxes. He reached across the table and began to stuff the chips into a pocket of Pole's robe. The blood-stained creature repeated the process 3 more times, until Pole's pockets were bulging with easily a year or 2 worth of income. His heart pounded in his throat and he was growing lightheaded.
All of you in this room will receive a share of the credits the Juireans brought with them. Use them as best you can. When humans win this war, and we will, trade will not be restricted among the worlds, nor will we hoard the secrets of technology. You will be allowed to start businesses and to prosper as never before.
The human, Cain was his name, looked again at Pole.
You only have to fear us if you join the Juireans. If not, then we will leave you in peace. Now you, come over here and start passing out these credits for as long as they last."
And then the human rapidly closed and opened one eye at him. Just one. Pol was at a loss as to the meaning of the gesture, but he sensed he and the blood-soaked beast had shared a moment, a connection of some sort. A heartbeat later, the creature was gone, dashing from the hall, with the female close behind. For a moment, no one in the room moved, and then suddenly there was a surge toward the table where Pol stood. Whether it was out of a sense of duty or survival, Pol began to place stacks of credits into the eager hands of the other occupants in the hall. He continued to pass out the chips as fast as he could, his actions maintaining a delicate balance between hysteria and panic within the noisy crowd of wide-eyed creatures. These credits would help, Pol thought. For a while. But then he would have a decision to make. He could continue down his current path, or he could try to find another line of work, one not associated with Juireans or the weapons of war. In light of the encounter he'd just had with the human beast, the latter path seemed like the most sensible and healthy to follow. Adam Cain and Sherry Valentine barreled their way through the angry and confused crowd of aliens outside the hall, heading for a back alley they'd scouted earlier. It wouldn't be long before the authorities would arrive and put an end to Adam's Robin Hood-like generosity with the Juirean credits. In the meantime, the quest for free credits would turn the once passive crowd of potential recruits into a raging mob of desperate individuals. If the humans were lucky, it would be hours before peace would be restored, and by then they would be well on their way off the planet. The killing of Juireans was always a dicey affair, and there was the possibility that all traffic off the planet would be halted once the killings were reported. So the day before Adam placed the small shuttlecraft they'd acquired from General Anger on the back of a transport truck and had it driven to an open field not too far from Land Hall. Adam couldn't risk leaving the shuttle at the spaceport. Locating it in the nearby field, away from any formal flight restrictions, would give them an opportunity to get off the planet, even if all the spaceports were locked down. It was well into day 18 by the time they made their way to the field, but there was still plenty of light from the nearby street lamps, as well as from the 3 moons of Hyben. The shuttle was sitting to the far left edge of the field, looking conspicuous and out of place, and as they sprinted across the field, Adam noticed the shuttle didn't look quite right. As they drew closer, the reason became apparent. The main hatchway for the shuttle was missing, as were the rear chemical jet ports. Even the electronic code box for the entry hatch was gone, with only bare wires dangling from the opening. The craft was sitting cockeyed on the ground, with one landing gear unit missing. And to top it off, there was even some graffiti sprayed on the surface of the shuttle. The craft had been stripped and tagged. The 2 humans entered the shuttle to find even more disappointment inside. The pilot house was one cavernous room of missing modules and orphan wires. Even the pilot and co-pilot seats were gone. Adam and Sherry stood in stunned silence, shoulders slumped, mouths agape. They were on a planet in Sector 16, 800 light-years from the fringe, and their only ride off the planet was now an empty hulk of useless metal. And to add to that, they had just killed 5 Juireans along with an untold number of bodyguards, and soon the entire planet would be looking for them. Sherry looked over at Adam.
"Here's another fine mess you've got me into,"
she said, half mockingly. He returned her gaze and flashed a wide smile.
"Look on the bright side. We still have our health."
"Yeah, but for how long?"
Adam shrugged, before the pair quickly moved to the aft section of the shuttle, to the ship's sole berthing quarters. Fortunately, most of their clothing was still there. Apparently the shrimp-shaped Hybens had no need for human-tailored clothing. After quickly changing out of their blood-soaked cloaks and tunics, Adam and Sherry searched the shuttle for their backup weapons but found none. The thieves had done a very thorough job. Adam was mentally kicking himself for letting this happen, although he knew he had locked the shuttle's hatch when they left for Land Hall earlier that afternoon. Yet the economy on Hyben was tough these days, and the natives desperate. This desperation only added to their resolve.
"What now, my captain, my captain?"
Sherry asked, as she checked the power charge on her MK-17. She had 2 surplus power packs, and that was all, except for her lethal projection blade. Adam had a blade of his own, plus an MK with 4 packs, and the flash rifle with 2 extra power units. None of their weapons would last long in a prolonged battle.
"It's obvious we have to find another ship to get back up to the Ju 224. And the Hyben and Juireans will be watching for any ship trying to depart."
And since you announced your name for all to hear, I think the Jays will be quite anxious to get their hands on you.
Sherry added.
Yeah, that probably wasn't such a good idea.
The name of Adam Cain had circulated rapidly throughout this side of the expansion, which was all part of the propaganda campaign the humans had devised a couple of months back. Already there were 3 other teams doing exactly what Sherry and Adam had done that evening: infiltrate Juirean recruiting meetings and strike fear in the hearts and minds of the potential recruits. During their strategy meetings back in the Fringe, it had been concluded that the Juireans would have the resources to produce a sufficient number of warcraft to go up against the human fleet, but if they couldn't find crews to man them, their numerical superiority would be nullified. Already, Crocus's spies in the other parts of the expansion were reporting that Adam's strategy was having an effect. The Juireans were finding it difficult to secure recruits from the more affluent member worlds of the expansion, so recently they began to concentrate their efforts on the poorer worlds, ones where the risk of going up against the humans was outweighed by the need for financial survival. Hyben was one such world. Yet with all the success of the propaganda campaign, it did require Adam and the other teams to travel deeper into Juirean territory, far away from any support or possibility of rescue should any unforeseen events take place, such as having your shuttle stripped by alien gangbangers. Adam knew the humans could never survive going up against a unified coalition of expansion planets, so their only hope was to keep as many of the members as neutral bystanders to the war as possible. And even though the strategy was working, Adam also knew that his tactics would soon have to change. The Juireans were traveling with more bodyguards these days, and as his terrorism activities continued, the Juireans would increase the security surrounding the meetings until infiltration would become impossible. Adam and his raiders would then have to resort to more indiscriminate methods of disrupting the meetings, such as bombings. An escalation of that sort would cause more civilian casualties, which would poison the message the humans were trying to send to the other members of the expansion, that it was humans versus Juireans, not the rest of the expansion. Adam was walking a fine line between his role as a terrorist and as a soldier. His only salvation would come with more quick and decisive human victories against the Juirean fleets. If so, then the simple reality of the situation would go a long way to deterring any mass volunteer efforts to man the Juirean ships. The recruits would be simply too scared to volunteer no matter how much the Juireans were willing to pay. It would be then that Captain Adam Cain, USN, could return to waging war the way he had been trained, straight up and in your face, and not with all this clandestine shit. This has been an excerpt from my book, Tactics of Revenge, Book 4 in the Human Chronicles saga. You can find the complete series on Amazon.com. Click the link in the description or search T.R. Harris on Amazon. You can also check out my website at bytrharris.com. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. Your support is greatly appreciated. All material on this channel is human-generated, except for the associated artwork and voices which were created through AI. Check out my 70+ novels on Amazon. Beginning over 12 years ago, I was one of the original authors of HFY material, showing humans as the Supermen of the galaxy. My goal was to turn every person on Earth into a Superman or woman simply because they were human. All my stories carry that same theme. As they say, humanity, fuck yeah. All material on this channel is original and written by author T.R. Harris. Copyright by Tom Harris Creations, LLC.